This video is brought to you by Raycon. What's up, Wisecrack? Jared again. Convicted serial killer Ted Bundy is hot right now. And if you find that sentence as weird as I do, then stick around. Thanks to the recent Netflix documentary series and the clumsily titled Netflix movie, Extremely Wicked, Shockingly Evil, and Vile by the same director, suddenly everyone's talking about Bundy. And not in just a, wow, what an awful person way, but in a, that Ted Bundy was hot kind of way. So hot, in fact, the actor cast to portray him was two-time MTV Best Shirtless Performance Award winner Zac Efron. After watching the film, though, we were left wondering exactly what the movie was trying to say. That's because it makes a weird omission for a film about a serial killer, actual murder. It makes a strong stylistic choice to deprive the audience of any scenes that show him murdering his victims until its final moments. For most of the runtime, it seems like the film is asking us to make up our own mind about a dude convicted of murdering a bunch of people. Also, there was some necrophilia. And with the casting of the undeniably handsome Efron, it feels like the film is trying to make some sort of statement about appearances and what they hide. This all seems kinda weird, right? A movie about a serial killer that spends the vast majority of its running time not on the murder stuff, but building an image of a charming guy defending his innocence. What is the movie actually saying about Bundy, or serial killers? Is it about the nature of evil? Is it saying anything at all? Well, let's find out in this What Went Wrong on Extremely Wicked, Shockingly, whatever, the Zac Efron Ted Bundy movie. And spoiler, Ted Bundy did it. But before we get into that, I want to give a shout out to Raycon for sponsoring this video. Raycon earbuds are the perfect wireless solution for your music listening needs. Believe it or not, I sometimes go to the gym, and if I am, music is a must, but having a wire that goes from your ears to your pocket has always been really awkward, and with all the moving around you do, the wires get worn and the earbuds die fast. I seriously go through like 5 pairs a year. Since switching to Raycon's E50 wireless headphones though, I haven't had any of those problems. Plus, they're half the price of most other premium wireless earbuds on the market. They're small, comfortable, and I barely even notice when I'm wearing them. They even send different ear tip options so you can get a pair that fits your ears. They come in a bunch of different styles and colors, have great sound quality, and are really discreet. Again, the best part is that they are half price of their competitors. So check out Raycon wireless earbuds and get 20% off your order by clicking the link in the description. And now, back to the show. Alright guys, first, a quick recap. Smokin' hot law student Theodore Bundy meets secretary Liz Kendall at a bar where they hit it off and start dating. Not long after, handsome Ted gets arrested as a suspect in the murders of multiple young women from the Seattle area. Despite being initially released and insisting to Liz he's innocent, Ted and his ripped abs are soon arrested again and put in jail to await trial. But he escapes, only to get caught a week later and sent back to prison, still protesting his innocence. He escapes again, but this time makes it all the way to Florida where, suspiciously enough, more women get assaulted and murdered. He's put back in jail yet again, but this time he finally makes it to trial. Somehow he manages to find time to get a woman pregnant and marry her in court.
Will you marry me?
Your Honor.
Yes.
And then gets found guilty and sentenced to the electric chair. Throughout this whole story, Ted's partner Liz clings to the hope that he was innocent, despite being the one who initially phoned him in to the police.
Ted Bundy.
The movie ends with Liz demanding to know the truth from sweet Teddy Boy, who writes hacksaw on the prison glass, and that counts as an admission, I guess, prompting a flashback to one of his many murders. We then see some of the real-life news footage of scenes depicted in the movie over the credits. The end. Even just from that brief summary, you kind of get the feel for how much the movie leaves out and how much it enjoys having Efron as the lead. Throughout the film, we're forced to pay attention to how Bundy looks and how handsome he is, and not necessarily what the character has or hasn't done. Purely from the fact that Teen Choice Male Hottie Award winner Zac Efron portrays Bundy, you know we're being encouraged to buy into Bundy's attractiveness. Even beyond the casting, the movie pushes the idea of Hot Bundy with the way the movie sees the character. Some of the first shots of the film are women gazing coyly and seductively at the camera from Bundy's point of view. When he escapes for the first time, he stops regularly along the street to wink and smile at women who all reciprocate. Several women are seen being interviewed who say how cute he is and immediately conflate that with how he must be innocent.
I'm not afraid of him. He just doesn't seem like the type to kill somebody.
And, well, wouldn't you? I mean, come on, look at that smile. Even the way Efron is filmed makes you desire the character of Bundy. We see Efron both semi-nude and butt naked, as well as multiple sex scenes either repeatedly flashed back to or lingered on in the moment. What we're saying is this movie wants to bang Zac Efron, and it wants you to as well, which I believe is known as laying a thirst trap. If we're being generous, this could be what's smart about the film. Even Bundy's judge said how sad it was that such a bright young man was going to the electric chair.
It's a tragedy for this court to see. It's such a total waste, I think, of humanity that I've experienced in this court. You're a bright young man.
The reason we even know that fact is because he was one of the first televised court cases, mostly because Bundy was so unassuming and handsome. The movie could be trying to depict him as a central figure in the move toward docudrama-style news reporting that we're so familiar with today. Whether it's the O.J. Simpson trial or the Serial podcast, Bundy's attractiveness can be seen as patient zero for this move towards sensationalism in media. If we're to understand this reaction to Bundy, we need to see him as handsome, and who better to accomplish that than High School Musical heartthrob Zac Efron? Well, maybe, but to understand why his casting and the way he's shot makes us uncomfortable, we need to dip into some philosophy, specifically the philosophy of aesthetics. Aesthetics is a pretty broad term, but it can be briefly summarized as the philosophy of art. The word gets its modern usage from Alexander Baumgarten, whose text Aesthetica, a word which had until then meant sensation, redefined it to mean a study of good and bad taste regarding art and beauty. Typical of Enlightenment thinking, Baumgarten was trying to apply principles of logic and reason to subjective choices. Today, the study of aesthetics has branched out to almost everything beyond art, to the point where my haircut and t-shirts are aesthetic choices. It's all about subjective things like beauty, taste, and appearances. In film, aesthetics can not only be about its appearance in the traditional sense, but the variety of choices that we might call artistic. Think framing, points of view, editing, costumes, the music, or how all this congeals into a mood. Aesthetics is a big part of the Bundy story because they both deal with the subjective appraisal of certain things, especially things we think of as being beautiful. Beyond casting a sex icon as Bundy, the film makes a series of aesthetic choices to play up his appeal. It's well shot with naturalistic lighting, uses traditionally attractive framing, and makes use of sympathetic film grain. That is to say, it's not grungy like Saw, but visually appealing. The production and costume design is certainly period correct, but the characters, especially Bundy, are wearing expensive and fashionable clothes, not just for the time, but for today too. Love that sweater, Zac. Combine that with the retro film stock moments like the 8mm home movie footage, and the whole thing has the appearance of an extended Instagram post. But deeper than that, the almost total lack of violence in the movie feels like an aesthetic choice too. Some of Bundy's murders are described in court
Strangled with a pantyhose garrote so tight that her neck was constricted to half its size.
but we don't see much more than the occasional photograph of bloodstains. Other than the last 5 minutes, Bundy is not shown harming anyone, and when he is, the effectiveness of the scene is driven by the sound design of that hacksaw, not the visuals. Extremely Wicked is aesthetically driven, just like the movie would argue the trial and legacy of Bundy is itself. Except there's that Goethe quote at the start. Few people have the imagination for reality. This quote implies the horrors the real-life Bundy enacted should not or cannot be imagined. Yet, by removing them almost entirely, is the movie asking us to imagine them? This is what people were forced to do with the real Bundy at the time, so the filmmakers make the aesthetic choice to keep his violence largely hidden. If it's not asking us to imagine the crimes, then should we just forget them? If the movie withholds a sense of disgust and we come away from it thinking Ted Bundy was more sexy than horrific, is that okay? What responsibility do filmmakers have to convince us that bad people are bad? This discussion on the aesthetic of evil and the intersection of aesthetics and ethics is something society has struggled with throughout history. From the devil in Milton's Paradise Lost to Nazis wearing Hugo Boss, the idea of bad things being beautiful has always troubled us. So how do we best represent that in art? For example, consider the movie American Psycho. Our protagonist, or the guy we're supposed to relate to, is a serial killer. We actually kinda like Patrick Bateman and want him to get what he wants. But the film, under the watchful eye of director Mary Harron and with a masterful performance by Christian Bale, is able to achieve a tone in which we're convinced that we're not supposed to take Patrick Bateman entirely seriously. This is the aesthetic of the film. So just because the hero of the movie is a serial killer, the movie doesn't celebrate serial killing. If it did, it would probably be a bad movie that we would all hate. This would be us making an ethical judgment in response to the aesthetic choice. This interplay between aesthetics and ethics has been explored endlessly by philosophers like Baumgarten, Immanuel Kant, Gilles Deleuze, and Jacques Rancière, just to name a few. But to figure out how to evaluate Efron's Bundy, we're turning to theorist Mary Devereaux. In her essay Beauty and Evil, she analyzes Leni Riefenstahl's infamous Nazi propaganda film Triumph of the Will and explains that it used a lot of innovative techniques for what was meant to be a documentary. Riefenstahl used dynamic camera movements only seen in fiction movies of that era by training camera operators to shoot while wearing roller skates. She dressed her crew in uniforms to hide them amongst the crowds and shot over 60 hours of footage that was edited together in dynamic ways. As Devereaux puts it, Riefenstahl's concerns were aesthetic, which meant the end result for the film is a beautiful vision of Hitler and New Germany that is morally repugnant. If the film is beautifully made but with a terrible message, it should be possible to separate these two factors. Devereaux defines this distinction between the aesthetic appraisal of a work of art from a moral one as aesthetic formalism, acknowledging that these two considerations may pull in different directions and should therefore be judged distinctly. Or as she memorably puts it, you can admire the beauty of a fog at sea despite its danger. Except Devereaux argues that isn't in fact possible, because admiring that fog will get you killed. A lot of Triumph of the Will's aesthetic principles are tied to its content. Until her death, Riefenstahl insisted the film was not propaganda, it was a documentary. But we can't ignore that her creative choices were overwhelmingly driven by a desire to make Hitler and the Nazis look appealing. Whether that's with interviews of people who solely express positive views about Hitler,
Für uns, unser oberster Führer, auch der oberste Gerichtsherr ist.
Admiring shots of the goose-stepping soldiers, or just the fact that it was shot specifically at a huge, grandiose pro-Nazi rally with hundreds of thousands of attendees, this is a movie about how popular the Nazis were. Devereaux explains that ever since Plato made the connection, society has always equated beauty with goodness, an idea that has long been associated with the study of aesthetics. But it's only in the relatively recent past that we've moved away from this idea, largely because of fascist groups like the Nazis who demanded racial purity and the resurrection of classical architecture. The aesthetic of the modernist movement after World War II resulted in very not beautiful things like brutalist architecture and bold abstract graphic design to try to reconcile the ugliness of a post-war world against the Nazis' desire for purity and beauty. Beauty is no longer central to art, as Devereaux puts it, but art can certainly render evil beautiful. Because of that, she says the best way to engage with something like Triumph of the Will is not to separate its aesthetic principles from its moral ones, but to, quote, engage with its vision. The vision she refers to is what purpose the work of art has and how it is presented. In film, this means the story, themes, and aesthetic should be critically read as a whole. By this standard, Riefenstahl's film is not a good work of art, not in spite of its aesthetic choices, but because of them. It is a film specifically designed to make the Nazis, and the awfulness that went with them, appealing. Per Devereaux, there is a reason to withhold the highest aesthetic praise from works that present as beautiful, attractive, and good what is, in fact, evil. So if we want to understand how something evil can be represented as beautiful and vice versa, it's worth considering what the vision for Extremely Wicked is. We're going to do that by comparing it to another Ted Bundy biopic. There's a ton of them, by the way. We just picked one out of the hat, the aptly titled Ted Bundy from 2002. This movie is a much lower budget, much more graphic retelling of the Bundy story and his crimes. It covers the same sort of time frame as the Efron movie, but goes all in on depicting many of Bundy's rapes and murders, and unlike Extremely Wicked, it's entirely disinterested with his appearance. A scene at the beginning where Bundy looks into the mirror and rehearses his greeting,
Hi there. Hi there, my name's Ted. Nice to meet you.
makes the point to the audience that his charm and attractiveness is false and he has to practice it. He's seen as charismatic by some characters, but we also see him rubbing one out in a bush, which kinda takes the sheen off him. Beyond simply not wanting to make the character attractive to the audience, this film's entire aesthetic is completely different than the Efron movie. Its budget means the picture quality and cinematography is nowhere near as crisp as Extremely Wicked. The period details and costumes are paid lip service to but aren't as in-depth. The violence is visceral and lingered on, and unlike Efron's depiction, at the end, we see Bundy humiliated in prison and die on screen in a graphic way. This low-budget video nasty aesthetic seems more interested in showing us the horror of what Ted Bundy did and who he really was. As such, the visions for the two films, despite telling the same story, couldn't be more different. Extremely Wicked wants to tell Ted Bundy's story but maintain an appealing aesthetic in much the same way as the real Bundy did. The problem with this vision for the movie, i.e. the way its aesthetic works with its story and themes, is that it's more interested in how it presents itself than in telling you the real story of Ted Bundy. By focusing on the perspective of Liz Kendall's character and what she knows about Bundy, we spend most of the time just as confused as her as to how we should feel about him. It's also really uneven in that it doesn't actually spend that much time with Kendall throughout the movie. We see the personal effect of the trial on her and her romance with the kid from The Sixth Sense, but we spend far more time with Bundy. If they were trying to tell the movie from the perspective of someone other than Bundy, it makes sense that we wouldn't have seen his crimes. Except that isn't the story being told. The majority is told from Bundy's perspective and Kendall's, so why don't we see his murders? The movie tries to juggle these two perspectives but doesn't fully commit to either, and as a result, tells the story of a sexy man less than a sexy serial killer. If the movie only wanted to give us a vision of Ted Bundy as a pop figure, it did a great job. But if people come away from the movie seeing him as more of a sex symbol than a mass murderer, is that okay? The 2002 Ted Bundy movie's intent, on the other hand, is to show a repugnant man for what he was, and it certainly does accomplish that, but importantly, that doesn't necessarily make it a good movie. The movie is bad for other reasons. In the end, both movies fail, but it's Extremely Wicked that suffers in the most awkward, creepy way. Given the publicity surrounding its release and the headline-friendly casting of Zac Efron, expectations were high, and while we can see what it was going for, its preoccupation with its own aesthetics leaves the viewer wondering, what was the point of that? What people think of as beauty comes with its own set of standards like clean, straight lines, symmetry, and a lack of blemishes, but all these things require hiding or removing something deemed unattractive. The real-life Ted Bundy knew this and used it to horrific effect by presenting himself as appealing and hiding the worst parts of himself. Netflix's movie does exactly the same thing. But what do you think, Wisecrack? Is Efron's Bundy worthy of another Teen Choice Award, or should one of the most prolific serial killers in American history be depicted as ugly as he really was? Thanks to all our patrons who support the channel and our podcast. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, and before you go, don't forget to check out Raycon wireless earbuds. For half the price of most competitors, you definitely want to snag these high-quality, stylish earbuds. Check out the link in the description to get 20% off your order today, and as always, thanks for watching, guys. Peace.